Alright, so we are back with another discussion video or thoughts video, whatever I'm calling them, regarding the Lord of the Rings. This time we're now into the Return of the King, so this will be the first 5 chapters of the Return of the King. And yeah, so we'll get right into that, and then I'll pull out my phone and go through my notes that I wrote. So anyways, the first 5 chapters of Book 5, which is the first half of Return of the King, are Minas Tirith, the passing of the Grey Company, the muster of Rohan, the siege of Gondor, and the ride of the Rohirrim. So Minas Tirith is, it's really a lore chapter in many ways, because you follow Gandalf and Pippin as they ride to Minas Tirith, and then as they get situated and started in Minas Tirith, as well as have Pippin swear fealty to Denethor and have him basically, it's a section where they kind of recount the story up to this whole point of books 1 through, or of Fellowship and Two Towers is very briefly, they do recount it. But so that's Minas Tirith. You meet Baragond, you meet his son Bergil, the other characters like that. You really get, actually Faramir appears again in this chapter, and you start getting a sense of what Gondor is as a nation and Minas Tirith as a city. Then chapter 2 is the passing of the Grey Company. This is, we now switch our perspective from Gandalf and Pippin to Aragorn, essentially, and you're following Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli as they ride they leave the Rohirrim to go on their own before the muster of the Rohirrim, because they've basically gotten word that if we want to save Gondor, we have to take this different route, which is through the paths of the dead. Is that what it's called? Yeah, through the paths of the dead. And so Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli they actually meet with a whole bunch, or with a company of the Rangers of the North. So Aragorn's friends and the people that he works very closely with when he's a ranger in the north. And then also Elladan and Elrohir, who are the sons of Elrond, they come as well, and come bearing a standard that we will see unfurled in a later chapter. So then in the passing of the Grey Company, they continue going, or they go through, they leave the riders of Rohan and Theoden and Éomer and stuff like that, and they go to Dunharrow, where they meet with Éowyn, and then they leave Éowyn and go through the paths of the dead. Through the mountain, they summon the army of the dead. They summon the army of the dead, call them to fulfill their oath, and then that's after the king of the dead and the army of the dead decide, yes, we will fight so that we can hold our oaths fulfilled, or so that we can fulfill our oaths, and so that Aragorn will hold their oaths fulfilled. They then go. That's where that chapter ends. So then chapter 3 is the muster of Rohan. This is Aragorn this is now Theoden. We're following Theoden's character, Theoden and Merry. It's through the point of view of Merry, because that's the only member of the Fellowship that we have left at this point in that place. So it's all through the perspective of Merry, but it's the Rohan gathers together, and we meet again with Éowyn. We meet with all of the Rohirrim, and they decide, okay, it's time for us to leave. We're going to go, and those who follow will follow when they can, if they can. There's not really a whole lot to the chapter, the Muster of Rohan. It's technically it's a 14-ish page chapter, but there's really not a whole lot that goes on. It's a discussion, talking about how we wish we had more men. There's a conversation between Merry and Theoden, where Theoden's like, sorry, you're just going to be more of a hindrance than a help to take you on this long, fast ride to Minas Tirith in order to get there on time, and it's not going to be worth it for you to come with us. As much as Theoden likes Merry, and as much as Merry wants to stay, Theoden says no. So then Durnhelm offers to carry Merry with him in order to go to Gondor, and there's some really cool stuff in that chapter with Merry's perception, the way that he's able to perceive other people and the way that he sees Theoden, but also the way that he looks into Dernhelm's eyes and sees them as someone who is going to die, who has no real hope in life. And that's the wisdom that you're seeing all these characters, all of our characters gaining, especially Merry and Pippin, who start out as our young characters who really don't know that much, really don't know what they're getting into. By the end of The Return of the King, you see how far they've grown just in what they're able to read of people as they look at them, and as well as so much more. So then we get to the Siege of Gondor as chapter 4, and Siege of Gondor is really the start of the battle for Minas Tirith. We see we see Faramir coming or going back to Osgiliath to try and hold actually it doesn't go to Osgiliath, it goes to the Fords of Rauros, I want to say. That doesn't sound right, but he goes, let me see, where's my map? So they go to, I guess it is Osgiliath that they go to. And anyways, they go to Osgiliath and they try and hold Osgiliath or take some back or something like that. And that whole garrison is wounded. Faramir is staying behind to try and keep as many people alive as he can while they escape, and then he'll come last. He comes last, but he is hurt and wounded. And then we really don't get to see a whole lot with that, because then suddenly the focus shifts to the protection of Minas Tirith and the siege of Gondor, of Minas Tirith itself. We see the Witch King coming. We see Grond coming. Grond is a giant battering ram that was forged in Mordor. Some really cool language used to describe Grond. And so yeah, they take and go to throw down the door of into Minas Tirith, the great gates of Minas Tirith, and we see the Witch King ride in on his big, massive black horse. He rides in and confronts Gandalf. Gandalf basically does the same thing as he does to the Balrog, where, with the Balrog he says, "You will not pass," whereas here in the Siege of Gondor he says, I need to find out exactly what the wording is, but it's, you cannot enter here, I believe is what it is, but I have to find it. It's not the right chapter. "You cannot enter here," said Gandalf, and the huge shadow halted. "Go back to the abyss prepared for you. Go back, fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master. Go!" And it's just, so he basically does the same thing where he's like, "No, you can't pass." And I like that that's Gandalf's initial response to anything big and evil is, "No, you can't pass." Anyways, alright, so then the next chapter is the Rite of the Rohirrim, and the mental image that phrase, the Rite of the Rohirrim, conjures up is that of the Rohirrim cresting the hill in the movies, and it just, all of them out before him, and then Theoden rides across with his sword, hitting all the spears and then giving his rousing speech. And that's the image that we have of the Rite of the Rohirrim, but that's only a very small part of the Rite of the Rohirrim. The chapter itself is, I love the chapter. So it takes you through the woods, the forest of Druidan, where we meet the Woses, or the Wildmen, and it's very, Gon is the character that specifically that we meet, and him and his people take the Rohirrim through the forest, basically in a secret path, to get into Gondor, into Minas Tirith, without being noticed, without being seen. And that's really what allows the Rohirrim to actually be of use to Gondor, because yeah, cavalry charge is nice and wonderful and all that, but if they couldn't have gotten there without being noticed, it wouldn't have done Gondor any good at all. So that's that whole section where they're just having the discussion with Gon Burigan, and they go through, and then they are traveling through the forest right up until that Ride of the Rohirrim and that last rousing speech and the blowing of the horns and the charge and everything. It's wonderful. And that is chapter 5. It's the Ride of the Rohirrim, and so that is the end of this section. So with that, we will now go into my notes here and see what I actually wrote down about these first 5 chapters. So the first one that I wrote down is the glory of Minas Tirith, and you really get a sense of this as Gandalf is describing Minas Tirith to Pippin, and then as they're riding through the streets of Minas Tirith up to meet with Denethor. And it's just the way, the descriptions that Tolkien uses. Again, I've mentioned this over and over again. Tolkien's writing and his ability to describe detail and setting is unmatched. Then we see the comparison between Gandalf and Denethor. Pippin is looking at the two of them. He's looking at how great and powerful and wise and strong-willed these two characters are. But he also, you see all the similarities, but you also see the differences. And that's, again, just the way that it's done is very well done. As massive and grand as Minas Tirith is, we often forget that it is but a fortress, and that Osgiliath was the major city of Gondor. So, Minas Tirith is a massive, huge city, but it's nothing compared to Osgiliath even. Osgiliath was the seat of power for Gondor for a very, very long time. Okay, where are we at then? The Dunedain. So this is just a note. I have the Dunedain exclamation point because I love the Dunedain, these rangers of the north that really don't mean anything to the rest of the world. That, like, nobody knows they exist, nobody knows the role that they actually play, but they're so cool. In the Passing of the Grey Company, you just start to meet them and you start to see their kinship and their character in relation to Aragorn and how important they are to Aragorn and how important they are to the world, and they're just super cool. I have also talked about the importance of the Oath of Gollum in previous videos, and here we see the importance of oaths again. The dead broke their oath to Isildur, so a curse was put upon them. That's a very... I really don't need to go over the whole thing with the curses, or with the oaths and how important they are, but to see it manifest in such plain, obvious, blatant terms with the dead, it works really well just to show how important oaths are, because they swore an oath to fight against Sauron when called upon, and they broke that oath, they hid, and so Isildur cursed them, and as was right to do because they broke the oath. The curse is part of that oath. If they break their oath, they will be cursed. And you see that curse. You see how horrible of not life that they have at this point, where they cannot rest. They cannot move on. They're forced to live undead for the rest of their lives. And it's just, for the rest of time until they can fulfill their oaths, until a descendant of Isildur, an heir of Isildur, can come and hold their oaths fulfilled. And so you see, yeah, they hate what's happened to them, and they hate men, and they hate everything about the world. But as soon as they're given the opportunity to fulfill their oaths, they're like, yep, we're doing it. Anyways, just some cool stuff. Baragond. I love Baragond. He's another one of those characters that we meet in Return of the King. We don't spend that much time with him, but we do spend a little bit, and he's just such a cool character. There's tons of characters like that. Imrahil is another one that I love Imrahil's character. You don't learn that much about him, but he's so cool. Grond and the Spells of Ruin. I didn't write it down. I probably should have written it down in my notes what exactly I was going with for here, but basically it's just thinking about the fact that Grond, upon it was placed Spells of Ruin, I believe is the wording that was used, or something along those lines, at least very similar to that. And what are these Spells of Ruin? We hear lots of times about spells that are being placed upon things, or I mentioned one with the walking sticks that Faramir gave to Frodo and Sam in the last book, and it's just what is all this stuff with the spells? It's a very soft magic. You don't understand what it means. because it really doesn't play that much of a role, except there are mentions of it, and I like finding these mentions. So to start at, my next note is the Witch King is riding a horse at the moment, not a fell beast. So the fell beast isn't like a name for the winged bird-like beings that the Nazgul ride. Fell beast is a description, but it's been taken as a name, and that's fine. But anyways, at the Siege of Gondor, when he rides into Minas Tirith, into the city through the gates that have just been destroyed, he's riding on a horse. He's not riding on his winged steed. But he also casts spells in forgotten tongues. What exactly does that mean? Because, I mean, obviously casting spells, that in and of itself we don't understand, because Tolkien doesn't go into what spells and magic are like in that way. We get a little bit. We know that Gandalf has said, I once knew every spell in the tongues of elves and men and dwarves. He talks about that back when they're at Moria. But what exactly does this mean for the Witch King? What is this forgotten tongue that he knows? Tongue obviously meaning language. What is this forgotten language is? And I don't know, just more information that we could have gotten more information on, and we would have loved it, but there's not that much. I love the Woses. Their place in the world is strange, and their necessity in the story seems lacking, but I love that they are there. Without them, the Rohirrim could not come unnoticed to the fields of Pelennor, and that in and of itself is reason enough for their inclusion. It's just another mystery of the world, and is one of the things that makes the world feel so real, so full. The wild men are said to never be seen by any writer of Rohan again. Just all my thoughts regarding the Woses, the wild men of Druadan. Just all of my thoughts compiled into one right there that I wrote down. I have more, and I talked about a little bit more as I was going through the chapters. But this one, the way that they're used, it's kind of in many ways similar to Tom Bombadil, where he just appears and it feels weird and then they disappear and are never talked about again. And that's not an issue for me. I don't have any issue with that because of how important they are and they aren't. So much of this book is them traveling through this world. And when you travel through the world, you find things that you never knew existed, and then you never come upon them again, and you never talk about them. It's just the way that this type of story is supposed to work, and I appreciate it all the more for that. But it's totally understandable why they would get cut from the movies, because they really don't seem to play much of a role, and most people would think, oh, these characters should be talked about more if they're with the way that our modern reader audience reads books. If they saw the Woses, they'd expect them to come back and play a role again later at some point, somehow. And they don't, and so it's understandable for them to be cut. And that is the end of... Oh, actually, that's not true. I have the description of Theoden's writing. Let me see if I can find this. So this is specifically a description in the chapter, The Riders of Rohan, that I really liked, and I didn't write it down because I didn't want to write it down in my notes as I was trying to listen to the book and trying to work at the same time. So I figured I would just wait and read it, but let me see if I can find it real quick. Easy. Suddenly the king cried to Snowmane, and the horse sprang away. Behind him his banner blew in the wind, white horse upon a field of green, but he outpaced it. After him thundered the knights of his house, but he was ever before them. Eomer rode there, the white horsetail on his helm floating in his speed, and the front of the first Ered roared like a breaker foaming to the shore. But Theoden could not be overtaken. Fey he seemed, or the battle fury of his fathers ran like new in his veins, and he was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, even as Orome the Great in the battle of the Valar when the world was young. His golden shield was uncovered, and lo, it shone like an image of the sun, and the grass flamed into green about the white feet of his steed. For morning came, morning and a wind from the sea, and darkness was removed, and the hosts of Mordor wailed, and terror took them, and they fled and died, and the hoofs of wrath rode over them. And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, and they sang as they slew, for the joy of battle was on them. And the sound of their singing that was fair and terrible came even to the city. It's the final paragraph in the chapter, The Ride of the Rohirrim. Just his description, you visualize it, the sun shining on his shield, making his shield glow brightly. His horse is white, the grass underneath his horse is just, the green is popping even more because of the contrast between the white and the gold shield, and it's just beautiful. And you see the image of Theoden out in front of everyone else. No one can overtake him. There's something about him that he is the king that he was always meant to be. And where that leads into with the rest of this, the Battle of Pelennor Fields, which we will get to soon, it's hard to talk about without just moving on to the next chapters, but it's very impressive the way that it's written and the way that it's told. And I don't know. Anyways, I'm just gonna end this discussion thoughts video there, and we'll talk to you guys again soon.